Now, speaking of time, we are here at the appointed hour. It's noontime in the East Coast of the United States. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining. I'm Eli Noam, and I'm very pleased to chair this session that is joined with the Columbia Institute for Teleinformation, CITI, and the International Media Management Academic Association, IMMAA. We've had distinguished speakers for the past year or two, and today is no exception. We're very pleased to welcome Christopher Yu, Professor of Law from the University of Pennsylvania. We're also very grateful to Christopher for pitching in, for joining on 2 days or so notice when our previously scheduled speaker had to cancel because of a medical emergency. It's nothing, as far as I can tell, that is worrisome. It's an appendectomy of some nature, but it takes him out of commission. We will reschedule. Christopher was gracious enough to join. He has been a longstanding collaborator with Columbia and a personal friend, and I'm very glad that he joins us. Let me just tell you a little bit about Christopher and what he brings to us here. But I have to be really brief. Christopher's CV, and I'm not making this up, is 64 pages long. If I just gave it sufficient justice, he would have no time to speak himself. So let me just briefly say that he brings in his academic appointments also his multidisciplinary background. He's not only the professor of law, but he's also a professor at the Annenberg School with an appointment there, Annenberg School of Communications, and at the Department of Computer Science. He is also the founding director at Penn of the Center for Technology, Innovation, and Competition, and co-director of the Law and Technology joint degree. So great background to have for this crowd, for this group here assembled. His academic background is a bachelor's from Harvard, yay, go, MBA from UCLA, that is business direction, but then law degree from Northwestern University in Chicago. He clerked for the distinguished Justice Anthony Kennedy, who was for many years the swing vote on the Supreme Court. And so a clerk for the swing vote probably kind of carried a lot of weight in decisions that still affect us today. His summer work, relevant to what we're doing here today, was with the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department. Chris has multiple books. I think most recently, a book called The Dynamic Internet. And he's had more than 100 articles, any of which, if you just look at the titles, is worth reading. In fact, is mandatory to read. He had visiting appointments in so many universities around the world that I'm not going to mention them except to ask the question, when is he ever in Philadelphia? And today he will address us on the topic of the economics of big data, pricing and valuing of big data. So a few words about the topics. Basically, everybody talks about big data, but what exactly is it? What is data and what is big? How big do you have to be, relative or absolute or relative market share? Computer science talks about data, information, knowledge, wisdom. Sounds good, but I'm not sure what it means in practical terms once you get close to it. What is it? Can we say that last year our wisdom has gone up by 9.5%? So people have been discussing the issue of what exactly is data, how to define it, what is the market.
Ellie, we lost your audio.
You did. Okay, just 1 second.
You're coming through loud and clear here.
Is all the sound going?
Yeah,
Can anybody hear me? Oh, there we go.
You're
Okay.
good.
Shall I just continue, or is there a problem?
Go ahead.
Continue.
So the question is kind of, even if we define what it is, what about sub-markets? And anybody who knows anything about antitrust understands that the definition of the market is half the case, whether you win it or lose it. The same fish can be a big fish in a small pond, antitrust problem, or a small fish in a big pond, which kind of gets off the hook. So there's some inconsistency here among activists, two activists for action and opponents. On the one hand, they want to show that big data is big and a huge menace. At the same time, they also want to win antitrust cases against specific companies in specific cases in specific courts. And so therefore, they want the market division to be as narrow as possible. And the other side has the opposite incentive. Same inconsistency also exists when it comes to remedies. Some people advocate access to bottlenecks such as data, access of competitors too. But some of the same people also advocate privacy, and how do you kind of maintain privacy if everybody can access the data. And the collectors of data, the companies, conversely suddenly discover their love for privacy protection, that they are the fiduciaries, and in fact that they should be large because the economies of scale and expertise in the protection of privacy, in the protection of decent applications for that data, the fiduciary aspect, in contrast to fly-by-night type companies with no scale and expertise and no brand reputation to protect. So this is basically the issue that we're dealing with. And Chris has done thinking over the years, and he's working on this right now, and he will share with us his insight, knowledge, and foresight. Go ahead, Christopher.
Well, thank you very much, Ellie, for such a kind introduction. It's wonderful to see so many friends here and making new friends as well. So happy to do that. A lot of it, Ellie's correct. Originally, this was motivated by competition law, but given the audience of media management and communications professors, I've tried to reframe it a little bit to be a more better targeted towards this particular venue. And I'll also say, this is done at the last minute. This is a talk I developed a little over a year and a half ago. And so some of the references I'll make I think they're good. There may be more recent ones, and I don't mean to slight those. It's just in the last couple of days I didn't have a chance to update them. And it's one of these projects which I got to a certain point, and we've all been there and put them on the back burner. And this is a chance for me to dust it off a little bit and to share some of the ideas with you. So I think Ellie has actually hit the framing exactly right, and which is we need a more granular understanding. And I have to admit, my primary motivation is sort of a dislike for terms that invite us to not analyze more complex phenomena and lump them together. I mean, one of my pet peeves is, and I've written an op-ed on this, is the term GAFA, which is often used in the press. And it's when you think about, Amazon's a online marketer and cloud company. Apple's primarily a device manufacturer. We have two advertising businesses, Google and Facebook, with very different hooks and different ways with search and social media, and they're all quite different. And understanding the role that data plays in all of them becomes, I think, important to understand in terms like big tech platforms. And to me, the big data part suggests that all that matters is the volume of the data. And what I'm going to try to do is to complexify this a little bit and to look at some of the empirical literature, because it's ultimately empirical that you find. I do find there's an empirical revolution happening right now in a lot of these spaces where we're moving away from purely theoretical models. And we're starting to see, if you look at, for example, the merger guidelines, you actually don't have to define a market anymore if you can show direct evidence of a price effect empirically. And in fact, and look at its impact on consumers and different things, it's a very sort of different world. So you'll see in the literature, they'll talk about different dimensions of consumer data, the idea of diminishing marginal returns and the tension between scale economies and minimum efficient scale, and the problems we have about entry. The idea also that data is only one input into a process is something that's is lost, and that relative importance of data as an input varies with the context you're using it in important ways, and the role of data varies with business models. And so I'll present you some empirical evidence on the top, to show basically that this is more complex and just to show that it's not just a negative sort of defensive talk or showing what we need to do. We are actually doing an initiative called the Economics of Digital Services here, where we give grants to researchers who are doing empirical work on digital services. We've done 2 years. We just had the year 1 roll up where we presented the material. We're actually issued the year 2 grants, and next summer we'll do year 3 grants, which will be the final year of the grant funding we got from the Knight Foundation. But our current plan is to continue it into the future. So if this is interest to you, consider that my advertisement for an opportunity for you to get some funding. Okay, so starting with scale economies and looking at the ideas, it's really interesting to me that scale economies are ambiguous, and we often think about them as really bad, but in fact, what you see is a tension between 2 different ideas. One is minimum efficient scale and scale economies limit the number of firms, but at the same time, one of the revolutions in economics in the last 50 years is understanding that scale economies create consumer benefits, and actually are really, there's a balance we have to strike here. And in the digital world, the scale economies, the consumer benefits are even more critical because they really need to work. And what we found is that a lot of the studies that look at in this space essentially don't really take seriously the idea that returns to scale diminish. And in fact, if you look at many of the models of network effects, you see constant returns to scale or inexhaustible scale economies that basically, of course, are going to lead to monopolies and market failure. And what you'll discover is logically, those features are of aspect to the model, not of reality. And so what you really need to do is think about taking the fact that diminishing marginal returns exist. We have various models that will do that, but what we really need is empirical analysis. So I started riding around in the empirical literature to try to understand this. And so some of the studies I'm going to show you are very interesting, and they're the most on point that I found when I did this review about a year and a half ago. Leslie Chu and Catherine Tucker did a natural experiment that exploited a change in the data storage policies at Yahoo and Microsoft to look at the impact on the quality of searches. And they looked at their measure of search quality was how often a search had to get repeated. As you know, all these studies, you can quibble with them and all this, but getting instruments for this stuff is, I get this, it's sort of interesting. And what they discovered was there was no change in the frequency of repeat searches with them dropping data storage. And that the shorter period of storage didn't seem to change that at all. And they concluded that, in fact, that there doesn't seem to be a huge scale advantage in search engines. And in fact, this is on the search results side, not the advertising side. And for reasons I'll talk about when we talk about the difference between structured and unstructured data, this is a pretty natural and logical result in what you see in a lot of the literature. So it's cute. I see, Bill, you talk about FANG in the literature. What I find is people stop referring to Netflix now that they're getting slaughtered by Hulu, Disney Plus, and everything else. And it's a great example to me about how these things change and how we think about these markets a little bit more dynamically. So another article by Newman and Tucker and Whitfield did a different aspect by looking at data brokers. And in fact, what they looked at is the quality. So this is third-party access, not done by the big firms. And one of the great questions that's unanswered out there is how often that do data brokers create a real opportunity? Because if there's a third-party market, all of a sudden this market looks very, very different. And what they discovered that is the value of data broker provided records varied a lot depending on the demographic you were targeting or the type of market you were targeting. It seems to work pretty well for some, but not so well for others. And so that suggests that talking about data as a monolith here, data brokers do seem to be a viable alternative for certain kinds of uses of data, but not for others. But what's interesting is not in their primary paper, but in an extension, and first, to go into something else we'll talk about in complements, is that the software matters, not just the data. And that, in fact, the ability to optimize it with software and data science as a complementary input seems to play a critical role here. But also abstracted from this into this wasn't part of the original study, but an extension, looked at the size of the data accessed by the different data brokers to try to assess whether the small data brokers had a better effect or a worse effect than the large ones. And she discovered actually no. The data brokers with access to much larger files didn't see a significant advantage. And the third study I'll show along these lines really focused more on economies of scope, although it did look at economies of scale. Some Amazon researchers led by Pat Bajari looked at the length of product availability as a proxy for how much data you got about that particular product. but also looked at the number of products available in that category to look for economies of scope to see if it actually affected the accuracy of weekly retail forecasts. And the answer was length of time where product availability did, and they actually found that they began to test what the returns to scale and what they are, and they actually found results that it decays at square root of t inverse. And they actually found, although they found scale economies, they did find that they were diminishing, and that it was going to allow us to do the kind of analysis and calibration to understand that. They found economies of scope didn't matter, which is a really interesting finding too when you think about how a lot of the data sharing remedies and different aspects play out here. And that in fact, the other point they made is, in fact, they did improve forecast accuracy to bring out the efficiency side of this. So the extent to which it improves the product, we have to take that into account as well. So what we're starting to see is, basically, we do see these studies that look at diminishing marginal returns, and really, I would caution us to the famous mantra, believe a literature, not a paper. But we do see that we need, there is some evidence that suggests that more is not always better, that this big monolith, just by throwing more data, and the people who have access to more data don't always get systematic advantages in every context in which they operate. And we really need to do more fine-grained work to understand these different aspects to it. And we'll talk about this a little bit more on the subsequent things, because we can chop this a little bit finer to see where the most likely candidates are likely to be. So the other aspect I don't like about a lot of the discourse about specifically about big data is it focuses exclusively on the volume of the data. And what you'll discover in a lot of the casual discourse, volume is only one of several issues that people are interested in. So they'll talk about inimitability, rarity, and value, and non-substitutability, and different things in the language. And the popular literature talks about V's, and volume is one, it's the number one, but it's also only one of them. Velocity, variety, and there's something of a cottage industry about finding more V's. And the biggest one I saw, there's one paper that has 42 of them. None of them are really tested, but the basic insight to understand that anyone who works with data, it's not just about the volume. And so what we have is some interesting studies that actually look at the different dimensions of data. The one that I'm actually working on the most is a distinction between structured and unstructured data. Now, structured data is data collected intentionally with a specific model in mind. Think a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet, or a database, where in columns and rows where you have a preset model, you may calibrate the coefficients a little bit, but you do that and you run something and you get an outcome. Unstructured at the other extreme are these big data lakes where basically you don't have a model in mind. You actually ask the algorithm to find the model that fits the best, but importantly, you don't even take the data structures that exist as given. You allow them to do deep learning on it to abstract from it larger data structures that weren't present in the data collection that allow you to move past it. And of course, these are polar ends. There's going to be semi-structured data in different aspects. And what's interesting is, just to jump to the conclusion, the scale and the different importance of data science varies dramatically based on what we're talking about, structured versus unstructured data. And the different tasks that you're asking them to do vary dramatically depending on whether you're doing structured versus unstructured. So for example, to take Google just off the top of our head, the actual search results are based on structured data. The advertising backend that generates the revenue is based on the unstructured data. And it ends up being a very different combination that you put them together, in which the different aspects of data and size play very different roles. So to look at the empirical ask some sort of top-level statistics and to try to look at some of the empirical literature on this, in fact, what you'll find is that typically the scale economies you see in structured data analyses are relatively small. And I don't have on this slide, but it's also the data science stuff is pretty small too, because to tweak out regressions and all that based on existing models, all that, it's not that hard. And the tools we have are pretty well established and pretty well accessible. And Hal Varian has a paper that points out when Google runs its search calibrations, it's on a vanishingly small amount of the data they require. It's on a sample of a minuscule amount of the data. And so they don't see the benefit, and that says a great deal. Unstructured data is much more important in terms of volume, and it's much more plentiful in large quantities. Unstructured data, there's tons of commercial entities like banks, telephone companies, retailers of all kinds have lots of access to it. But what's amazing is no one knows what to do with it. And so what you're going to see is this critical component in which you have a much more availability, but a much more complicated world to make it work. And I will tell you as we'll go on, the tools don't transfer and they're very complicated and hard to work on. And so what we're going to see is in some of these things, there have been some interesting studies of unstructured data. I'm throwing up 3 of them here. DeFortuni actually wanted to looking at for traditional analytics, that is, think structured data. Increasing data doesn't really change things very much. But in the structured world, having more fine-grained data actually helps you more. You can have problems with overfitting and other things that we can talk about, but it's sort of a cautionary flag here. Now, what we find in Lo Giudice is that structured data tools don't translate well, and they actually looked at different aspects, and then finally they're finding that unstructured data does a much better job at certain things. They're taking these complex realities. All of us who worked with data, especially when I worked on the business side, I always wanted to know, what question am I not asking that's in this data that I should be asking, that I don't know to ask? And you kind of want the data to talk to you. Unstructured data is very good about that because you don't give it the model and you don't query it, basically. You allow it to find out the patterns that you don't know exist. But the art of nursing that out is really quite difficult. And so what you're discovering is that in that sense, unstructured data tends to benefit from more data much more. And their solution is, for most people, is just to throw more data at it. And it gets better and better, but the data science to coax that out, it's harder. And so, I would say, we do need to look at different types of it and disaggregate the different aspects. I'm focusing on structured versus unstructured. I'm sure there's other ways we can think about it as well. And to think about these not by just saying, what's your total volume of data, but to put it in different buckets and to start to understand the role that it plays in terms of its complementarities with data science, which is my next point. And my last point is going to be its complementarities with the business model you're running, because that's going to vary a lot depending on what you want to do with the data. So in terms of the complementarities, the big one out there is data science and algorithms. And what you see is there is a growing empirical literature that really says that data analytics is a key complementary input to getting value out of data. And that simply, providing access to data is not enough. There's lots and lots of people who have tons of data and don't know what to do with it and aren't able to extract value from it. And that, in fact, what we see to some extent in terms of improved ability is not so much just a product of the data that has access to, but rather investments in hiring data scientists, which are extremely expensive and extremely hard to hire these days, to try to do the work for you. And there's a really interesting study, sorry about the animations, by Banco and Brill from 2001, where they actually did a tournament of different types of algorithms. And this is one of the more interesting studies because it shows a lot of things here. You see a clear return to scale. This is all obviously natural language processing based on words. You also see the clear diminishing returns to scale. But you also see a distinct spread in the quality of the algorithms that are used. Some of them converge very nicely. You see this red line here on memory base, which starts off performing better at very low scale, performs significantly worse at higher scales. And what you see is some heterogeneity here, which I think is very interesting. And, depending on, I always look at this graph and wonder, what hypothesis does this confirm or reject? And so, after playing around with this is, a lot of it depends to me on how much data you have to begin with, which is where are you on this curve and how quickly you get up on them. If you're down on the far left part of these graphs where you have that blue winnow thing way below the memory-based one, if that's your expectation of the volume of data, this has one set of implications. How fast you get up and converge matters. What's at stake? These differences between the red line and the others seem to be significant, but even among the clusters at scale, how important is those fairly small differences? Maybe in making recommendations for purchases, they may not matter very much, but in medical diagnosis, it might matter a lot. And so what I find myself going naturally to is the notion that, in fact, there does seem to be some difference among algorithms, but understanding the importance of that difference is going to require a lot more context than people generally throw at these things. And there's another tournament done by Zhang et al. That looked at 7 algorithms that are pretty well established against a robust set of 12 data sets spanning a wide different number of fields and a wide different range of optimization criteria. And they found that the performance of the algorithms varied a lot. and that in fact what they found is algorithms for structured data worked very well on small data sets with high correlations, but less well on unstructured data sets. And the thing that we were chatting about earlier with Ellie before we got on is the assumption, storage is cheap. When you're talking about some of these problems in terms of storage and memory and particularly running time, they actually can become significant. And so what you're starting to see is the nature of the problem, what you're working on, can actually create a diffusion here. And what this really suggests is that the algorithms that you use and the choice in developing and tweaking them out matter. And what we see is a tremendous shortfall of data talent in this. You see, different statistics. These are a little dated at this point, but you'll see them. I could update these fairly easily. I always tell, I've got two 20-something kids, and I always tell them, if you want full employment, be a data scientist. It's just a really pretty safe way to go. And right now, people are really struggling to find this. So what I would say is, the quality of algorithms do matter. It matters depending on the domain. It matters more for unstructured data than for structured data. And success really depends on having to know it. And the bottom line is, data is only one of the inputs, and that all the access remedies, if they don't actually think through this problem more completely, may impose a lot of access and not actually move the needle very much. And so understanding how this actual system works is kind of interesting. The last one, and this will be fairly quick, business model dependency. This is going back to my initial qualms about GAFA, and GAFAM and all the other things that have shown up in the chat that are wonderful. But it's one of the things that, you have to realize that these are very different businesses. And how they use data and how recent it has to be and how much you have to be has to be different. I mean, it might be exactly the same by some miracle that online retailing and cloud providing and device manufacturing and search advertising and social media advertising and streaming media would all have the exact same returns to data of exactly the same kind. But there's no theoretical reason to believe that, and there's pretty strong empirical evidence to believe not. And so what we'd have to think about is not just data in the abstract, but in connection with particular business models. Just to take a very simple comparison to two things in the same regime, search algorithms. And this is the same basic motivation. But if you're Amazon, you're trying to make search recommendations based on purchasing behavior, purchase recommendations. Search is looking at past research behavior. And for Google, for horizontal search. And this doesn't even get into the other things you get into, think about for what you're interested in streaming media or different aspects like this. And so the idea that we've divorced this from context as much as we have, I think, is problematic. And so what I would say is that, the four empirical literatures I'm pointing at, says it's complex. I hate that as a conclusion to me as a scholar, because to say it's complex without any real great solutions is either throwing your hands up or an invitation to say this is all a waste of time, let's just go do what we want. I don't believe that. And I do think we just need to start to do the hard work that scholars do, which is start to push this bumble out, find out which differences matter, find out what they do along the different dimensions I suggested here. As I said, we're not just doing this in the abstract, we're putting our money where our mouth is, we're actually supporting it. And if you want to ask me about anything or some of the sites, here's my contact information at the end of the slides. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Chris. We're going to open this up now to a conversation, questions, comments, etc. Basically to perhaps get the ball rolling, let me ask the first question while you gather your thoughts. Chris, you put a question mark to the economies of scale here on data, and thank you. That was very, very useful to understand. But what about the analysis, let's say the AI part on top of it, the software? Wouldn't you expect there to be quite a tremendous economies of scale?
Absolutely, and it's one of these problems we have. The question is, you see fewer entry barriers there or restrictions, which is competing for data scientists is open for any firm. And we can get into arguments about the ability to pay money for them. A lot of startups are able to hire them, for sweat equity, but also able to raise capital behind the idea. And the hope is that, it's not clear to me that it faces the same structural restrictions that data do. But more generally, even if you do believe that they may find restrictions, that means we have to do two parts of this analysis to look at the access to talent for data science and data separately Because even if we follow the DMA's suggestion to open up access to data, if the real bottleneck is data science, is AI, or if it's a equivalent bottleneck, it's an incomplete solution. And so understanding the relationship between the two is essential to requiring figuring out what the fix is. Otherwise, we'll do half a solution.
Thank you very much. Let me let me start to recognize hands up. Why don't we start with Norbert Jastrow from Germany? Go ahead. No, go ahead, Norbert.
You're still on mute, Norbert.
So I'm unmuted now. You can hear me.
You can hear
Thank
me.
you very much, Professor Noam, and thank you very much, Professor Yu, for these considerations, which are highly valuable with view on the data regulation ahead in Europe. You may know about this a little bit. As discussed here in Europe, data utilization regulation shall cover a broad range from altruistic data provision to commercial data monetization. As you address the relation between data value and business model applied, what I should fully subscribe indeed, the question arises, what does this mean to the issue of trade-offs between data sovereignty and data sharing? For example, to be a little bit more tangible, will we see a market emerge where consumers can monetize their data, or will the commercial exploitation of private data remain with the providers of digital businesses? What is your opinion on that? Thank you.
I actually think consumers are monetizing their data right now. The most obvious version of this is a little bit dated, but about 5 years ago, the New York Times gave me two options. I could get home delivery in the city of Philadelphia for $32 a month on the morning of, or I could get online access for free if I let them put cookies on my browser. So I could actually get real-time access, searchable access, actually a better product, a more current product, at the cost of effectively opportunity cost of $32. And so what you see is I've actually done some writing actually going back to my old days. My first incarnation as a scholar, it seems increasingly dated, was about broadcast television and the impact of advertising support as opposed to pay television was one of my topics once upon a time. It seems quite quaint by today's standards in many ways, but there we are. And there was a literature that actually looked at advertising support versus models. And what I would say is basically most online users of Google and other services, not free, but I would call advertising supported services, are monetizing their data right now because they're getting valuable services in return for an ability to access their data. And if you poll them and ask them whether you would allow them to pay, if they pay for it, they won't do it. So let me think about this. AT&T has a product, a fiber to the home. And they will offer you a $20 a month discount if you allow them to monitor your data and serve you ads based on it. I think the take rate on that is something like 90%. And so, and we can have questions about whether the disclosure is adequate and all these other things, but it's pretty clear to me that I do think there's a rational number at which people will do that. And in some level, all of my students, when I teach them privacy, I ask them how many of them use a Google product. The answer is 100%. And out of some 60, 70 students, at the end I always ask them how many. I spent a fair amount of time being fairly explicit about what Google does. And I asked them how many of you stopped. The answer is 3. And I asked them why, and they say why they didn't change is the product works beautifully and the price is right. And so what we find is the literature says actually direct payments would be much, much better. I mean, advertising support is a voting system. It distorts incentives. It tend to underrepresent the amount you like the product, and there's all these classic economic flaws with it. But it's incredibly popular with consumers. So if we're going to stop people from monetizing their data by getting advertising supported, or if you will, free services, it's unclear whether we'd be doing consumers a favor by doing that.
Thank you. Okay, there are several hands up. I will stay with Europe for one more question, and then I'll move to Ben and to Mike. Bill Drake in Geneva, go ahead.
Thanks. I appreciated a lot about what you said, Chris, but particularly the differentiation of structured versus unstructured, and looking at the ways in which that plays out. One of the things that drives me crazy in a lot of the spaces I move in is that people talk about all these data dependent industries in a very overgeneralized way and very undifferentiated. And the generalizations are all based on 5 companies, where you've got companies all across the digital economy gathering data and using data in all kinds of ways. But people are all going to make generalizations about how the digital economy works and what the threats are, et cetera, based on 5 companies. And governments are beginning to make policies around data that are also predicated on these fairly narrow and misapplied understandings of how the larger topography. So I'm just wondering, as you look at like what's going on in Europe with the Data Services Act or with the Chinese regulations and algorithms and so on, are you detecting that this inability to differentiate the different types of data players, data uses, et cetera, is having a particular consequence in the policy realm? And if so, what could we do to try to steer policy makers in a more subtly and nuanced direction?
The answer is it is having an effect, and there is some things we can do. So to me, Exhibit A for the negative effects of lumping things together was the House report published, I guess, about a year ago by Cicilline, where the basic form of this was they got testimony from 4 companies, identified particular practices different for the big four companies that they're doing, lumped them together in, I think they call them digital platforms or dominant digital, I can't remember the exact term, but they generalized from 4 specific different failures in different markets to a composite, and then put together a series of reforms that actually weren't specific to digital platforms at all, like change the merger guidelines for everybody. And I'm sorry, if I got that paper as a professor, I'd give it an F. It's just not good work. To the credit, I think the Europe was always better about this, and the U.S. proposals have moved past that and have become more targeted in terms of leaving out the non-digital industries, but still tend to lump them all together. And it's an interesting problem because what you're going to have to do is the remedies for the different businesses are going to be so different, but the tendency is to really turn them all into something very similar. And what I find this to be really characteristic of is what I think of as the regulatory move, where there's a general dissatisfaction with competition law, and if you as the solution, and if you look at CMA, ACCC, all the European things, they're explicitly moving to regulatory methods. And I remember when I actually presented this stuff to the ACCC, I said, aren't you basically saying that you can't prove a competition law case because otherwise you'd have just brought it? And their exact response was, yeah, we were kind of hoping no one would notice that. And so then the question now becomes, is there a flaw with the standard in competition law that makes it inadequate, that it's not actually penalizing people for behavior we want penalized? In which case, what's the right solution? Or is it just people can't get the result they want and they want to do something else? Within competition law, there's a very interesting concept, which is a difference between what we call per se illegality and the rule of reason. And it's also reflected in the legal debates around what we call rules versus standards. A rule would be 60 kilometers per hour is the speed limit. A standard would be drive safely. And the nice thing, what they tell you is the rule is harder to write, but easier to enforce. The standard and is enforced, and you write it ex ante. The standard is easier to write, but harder to enforce. And it involves this big trade-off, and competition law has a formula, which is don't set an ex ante rule unless you know the phenomena, you're really familiar with it. And second, your inferences are so clear that it's so rarely beneficial that outlawing it without any elaborate analysis won't really harm consumers. And the regulatory move is essentially a belief that we know this well, and that we know that the impact is severe enough that we're not going to lose anything. I don't believe that. I don't believe either premise. And to me, the hard cases we have from a policy standpoint is when the inferences are ambiguous. And there we need a filter that separates the good cases from the bad cases. So, I mean, I think to go a slightly different direction, I'm writing something about nascent competitors and acquisitions. And, you know, people always say, oh, it's these killer acquisitions. When Google bought Android, they had 8 employees and no revenue. And it's unclear whether, you know, it wasn't anything then and whether it was the association with them that made it that way. All of them will tell you cutting off our market's not a good thing for us. And so we actually have to have a rule that separates the acquisitions that are going to cut off a potential competitor from those that don't, and get a heuristic to do that. And the big cautionary sign here to me is GDPR. When something you said, Bill, triggered this in my head. We also have to remember, by fashioning it around the 5 companies, the companies that have the hardest time complying with these rules are not the big 5. They'll manage. It's the little guys. And we've seen this with GDPR compliance. We've seen it with California privacy law compliance. And that we have to be very, very careful about how we calibrate these things.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christopher. Ben has his hand up, but he might have gone. Ben, are you still on? All right. Mike Nelson, go ahead, Mike.
Chris, thank you very much. As always, a lot of interesting insights and very concise ways of putting things. Here at Carnegie, we've been doing a lot of work on machine learning in particular, and trying to do something different than all the blah, blah, blah on artificial intelligence, ethics, and regulating algorithms. And the reason we're doing that is because we don't see that regulators have all that many levers to pull when it comes to redesigning algorithms that tech companies are making. And particularly because these algorithms are rewriting themselves every hour in response to big data, it just seems like an intractable problem. And the result will be regulations that sound good in a press release and aren't really enforceable. So our focus has been entirely on the data and how people feed that data into machine learning algorithms and the results that come out. So rather than trying to get Google and Facebook and Amazon to design ethical machine learning algorithms, we try to do something that will help governments understand that they do have some levers to pull when it comes to data. I mean, they can make data available, make sure it's good quality data. I mean, they can audit data. It's easy to understand data than it is and to evaluate it than it is to evaluate an algorithm that's very complicated and changing by the minute. But my problem is getting people to understand that this different approach makes sense. And this is sort of a marketing problem, but how do we get people to focus on the data rather than on the algorithm?
So you said you're focusing on the data and the results. I'm with you not focusing on the algorithm. I'm not with you on focusing on the data. I'd focus on the results. What my opinion is, you know, I'm teaching a seminar on AI in the law right now, and we're actually bringing in a lot of outside speakers to try to understand this. And this is where I would say the computer science background in me actually helps. And this is where that is critical. What they will all tell you is the characteristics of AI are an emergent phenomena that any computer scientist will tell you. Systems generally are emergent phenomena that only appear at scale. Mm-hmm. And for the people who have social science background, I started off here, I always think of Emil Durkheim's suicide, which is he always said that the microanalysis of suicide misses the boat. Trying to ask people why this person committed suicide was wrong. It's more a societal level artifact that is causing it. It's the fault, the breakdown of the church, the breakdown of the family, urbanization and mobility that were the larger structural factors that were doing it. And by looking at the details, you miss the forest for the trees. I think in terms of systems analysis, that's mother's milk. And so what you'll see is, you know, I've got some stuff writing about data transparency. I think a transparent algorithm ain't going to do you very much because you may be able to prove that the algorithm has no bias on itself. Hey, algorithms can create proxies that reconstruct those like that. Or it can actually have phenomena that even if none of it's a direct proxy, it can actually have certain effects at scale based on the way that things interact. And so understanding how that works, auditing has to look at it, and we have huge problems with then, well, how do we test this? We can't just look at outputs because if the you have to have a base rate comparison of what the underlying population is to know whether you're off. And we have a huge problem of denominators, whether you're talking about percentage accuracy of the whole population or of the actual people who are positive with a characteristic. It is actually impossible to equalize both mathematically. Mm-hmm. So there's a huge set of questions we have to do about this to understand what proper implementation of this is going to be, which to me is not just looking at the data. I wouldn't say not look at the data that looks in, but it's by far to me, incomplete compared to looking at the outputs that come out and understanding the societal impacts of what they're going to do. Mm-hmm. So there's a paper that's in my future that's going to start playing around with some of this and actually to really try to think about this and comparing it to certain aspects of law in areas where we looked up, look at it again in these two different ways. Whether it's formally neutral or whether the results it achieves are actually doing what we want them to do.
Is anybody else using this phrase data transparency, and how are you defining that?
Well, I mean, this gets a whole different set of arguments that I'm starting to work on, which is I think data transparency is important for at least two reasons. One I just mentioned, which is understanding what people are getting for sort of fairness and use, but the other thing I'm starting to see is people are just using algorithms without understanding their provenance. And they're grabbing data to train without understanding where it was gathered, the heterogeneity in it, the scope, all these other problems that we have. And without knowing the data that you're using and without knowing the source of the data that the algorithm was trained on, you have no way of knowing when it's a proper use of that algorithm and when it's not. So I'm always thinking about all these hedge funds that do great for 5 years, 10 years, and then they have this catastrophic death. Why? They get a configuration of data they've never seen before, and they'll extrapolate from it, but they're shooting off into the wilderness. I mean, they really don't know what's going to happen. To take a slightly less pejorative context, that people who do weather tell me this too, which is, the times they get really bad forecasts is when they get configurations of data that really don't resemble anything that they've seen before. When they've got good data, they can do it well. And so understanding when you're using an algorithm, when you're inside the training data set and outside the training data set, is essential to knowing when you're doing something properly. Because it's okay, and it's better than nothing when you're outside, but you want to know. And second is when you're actually training stuff on data, you want to know where it came from, what the population looked like, where the variety is, and all this other stuff. And so it's really difficult. And I see, Diana's question, is it too late? I think you have to do both. Many people are focusing on the inputs because that's where we get traction. We have to look at the outputs, but that raises a very complex question about what proper metrics are for outputs. Because simply leveling outputs probably isn't right. Because there's a base rate difference that may be varying on different things, and we can control for stuff, but then we always have confounding variable problems, and and you're going to have a pretty strong normative idea of what you're doing before you start to penalize people based on these kinds of the end result analyses.
Thank you.
Thank you. I encourage you to ask other questions and to in the chat, but even better, speak up. So let me ask you a question. I had hoped that I would come out of here, and perhaps you can still help me with this, Christopher. What is a methodology to value a database? How would you go about, I mean, I know the one answer is it all depends, but what does it depend on? And please don't give us 42 different V's here.
So, my hope would be is like all complex valuation problems and all good empirical problems, is to choose not a single methodology, but a robust set of different methodologies on different data sets and hope you get convergence. Because this, we have a replicability crisis and all these other things we can talk about, but even basic real property valuation on your house, there's 3 standard methods, replacement cost, capitalized earnings, and comparables. And so the obvious things here when I think about valuations of anything, of inputs or assets, large N market studies that look at accounting data, to look at value and to try to find correlates. I think about, I've done some work on the old innovation market stuff where they're looking at like R&D valuation and patent valuation, all this other stuff. There's things that you can actually look at in terms of stock market valuations. If we can get access, and I have some people who I know have done this in other contexts, but not in data, to revenue estimates or revenue data, or to go to some other data source to get impressions on it, and to actually start to do some sort of empirical traction by getting different methodologies and research and identifications to start to get some traction on what the relationship is. And that's the kind of work that a lot of grad students could, I think, do. You know, it's data cleanup and sources, and the biggest constraint we have is access to the sources. But it's actually no more difficult than the same problems we faced in IO and lots of different areas.
So if we have, let's say, if we understand that value is that the information, the data has value, then wouldn't it also mean that if a regulation forces an organization to disclose that information, in other words, to reduce its value, that you would have a takings issue?
Well, takings is a notoriously American phenomenon, and it's an interesting problem here. Takings and intangibles has always been difficult. And there's one major case about trade secrets that plays, and about when a government can essentially condemn it. But the other problem is, if you end up in a world where you don't actually take it, you simply burden it, you're in a world called regulatory takings, where the law is very permissive because regulations limit the value of property all the time. I mean, they'll change zoning on you or put emissions requirements. And so it has to pass a certain threshold of depriving you of value before it gets there. And then, much as you talked about market definition earlier, Ellie, the denominator problem there is huge. What's we're talking about there is largely a question of how we frame the base level of value, and those get very, very complicated. In general, those cases lose. And so, and this is a lovely literature where they talk about not just takings, but givings. There's different regulatory moves that governments make that actually enhance your value. Should they charge that instead of the government paying you? Should they charge you for all the things they do for that? Arguably so. I mean, there's a theoretical argument for it. And in fact, I'm organizing a conference on law and STEM junior faculty forum where a person is talking about this in the healthcare financing space, which is they're actually increasing the value for a lot of enterprises based on how we're doing the ACA, and Obamacare. And there's some really interesting arguments we can make about that. But the bottom line is, I'm reading in the chat about throwing up our hands about valuing data. It's all the more reason to me to rely on ex post remedies of proven consumer harm, and use that as how we traditionally have done this. I mean, we've really lived through this in the vertical integration space, which has probably been the biggest revolution in economics. 60 years ago it was basically per se illegal. We have a bunch of theoretical models that came out that showed that it's more balanced, that it's at least ambiguous. We have some lit reviews that show it tends to be neutral to positive, and that the cases of consumer harm are vanishingly small. And this all comes together to me in the AT&T Time Warner case, where a parameterized theoretical model lost to a empirical study of the last 4 vertical mergers in the space that showed they were all good for consumers. Which is, we're starting to see these more robust empirical analyses that start to move things in that way. And our standard answer with this is when it's ambiguous theoretically, at a minimum, you don't make it per se illegal. You sort of do a ex post analysis. And to me, that's very different from the current debate in the House bills moving through the US Congress, and very different from the DMA and what the CMA is talking about. And so it doesn't have the hallmarks of a place where we're ready to use the blunt axe to divide certain things. But it does seem to be where things are going.
I'd like to link with the chat here. Diana had a point that she made that was partly addressed already by Christopher. But would you like to restate it for all of us, and Christopher, and as well as Norbert, who addressed it also, kind of deal with that? Diana, would you like to speak?
Oh, yes, thank you. I'm still in my graduate studies, so we had some research presented by our professor about data that was very biased. And because of this biased data, the algorithm analyzed, for example, when it saw a laptop, that it's always a male person who is working in front of the laptop. And they made, they looked at which aspects of the photo the algorithm is analyzing and saw it's always repeating our cliches we have in our day-to-day life. And so when you said you find it very important to look at the results, for me, thinking of ethics and all the bias we as humans have in our day-to-day life, that we need to be extra cautiously about the data we are using for our algorithms. And that's why I ask, isn't it too late to only look at the results and not to work at a very clean data sets, very unbiased data sets as much as possible?
So I'm going to mostly agree with you and going to try to complexify it a little bit. Okay, so there are two, on the law side in the US, there's actually two ways we think about this, which is what we call disparate treatment and disparate impact. You know, you can't treat things in a discriminatory way up front. That's illegal. But in addition, there's a separate claim for disparate impact. So even things that are facially non-discriminatory may actually have discriminatory impacts in fact. And so we have to do both ends of the analysis. But let me make this a little more complicated. You're talking about biased data. I would actually say all data are at least somewhat biased, and it's a question of what, in relevant part, we have to create standards about what we're looking for. Because the idea that all data is going to be different, or else what's the point? You're actually just going to get things. So we need actually a framework of standards of what the thresholds of that are going to be and what kind of variations we're going to tolerate. And so that's a huge problem. But the other one that always bugs me is the second part of AI. Forget, you just talk about the training data. We also then use some sort of test data to work against it. So, for example, for image recognition, there's been a standard image that became the determinant for all quality. And we all know there's a huge problem with what we call overfitting, which is if you end up having a uniform thing, you'll get something that's perfectly designed to get that image 100% correct. That doesn't mean it's going to make it good. It's very good at finding that picture. And so that picture classically is of a white woman. And so that actually, they've deconstructed and actually found that the test, not just the data used to train it, but the testing regimen you're using actually has an impact as well. And then even if you do all that well, once you let the algorithm loose in the wild, even if it passes all your test data, it's still going to show up with biases and that are only going to come up in after the fact testing. So I'm not really disagreeing with you, Diana. I think you have to do both. But a lot of the discourse is looking first at the facial terms of the algorithm and second at the facial characteristics of the data. And most people don't want to do the analysis of the outcomes. And I think it's an incomplete move. Ellie, you're on mute.
Trying to unmute myself. So thank you, Christopher. Thank you, audience. We are out of time. First, I'd like to thank you, Christopher. I'd like to thank Jason Buckwright for organizing this, and I'd like all of you to thank all of you for your attention, questions, and comments. Let me just remind you or mention who our next speaker is going to be. We always do these events on the first Thursday each month. The first Thursday in November is November, I forgot the date, November the 4th. The speaker is Julia Caget from Paris Sciences Po. And we look forward to hearing from her and hope that we will enjoy it as much as we've enjoyed Christopher today. Thank you very much, everybody.